In the final days of summer 1864, when the Confederate cause was bleeding to death in Virginia trenches and the Mississippi River ran red with more than clay, a different kind of war was being fought in the cypress swamps that stretched like fingers of hell into the deepest corners of sunken Trace County. The air hung thick as molasses, heavy with the perfume of magnolia blossoms, and something far more sinister, something that made the Spanish moss recoil from the windows of cypress wheat plantation like mourning veils afraid to touch the glass. Local fishermen spoke in whispers of lights that danced in the mansion's windows long past midnight, of screams that echoed across the black water when decent folk should have been sleeping, and of a bride whose kisses carried death itself in their tender embrace. The records tell us that 3 members of the ancient Devereux family died that autumn in what Union Army physicians called a mysterious contagion. But deathbed confessions from surviving witnesses paint a far more disturbing picture, one of forced unions and poisoned sacraments, of a breeding program so methodical in its cruelty that it manufactured its own destruction. What investigators would later discover was not the work of disease or divine retribution, but the methodical execution of a plan so patient, so perfectly calibrated to exploit the very rituals that bound this decaying family together, that it turned their most sacred ceremonies into instruments of slow, agonizing justice. The wine they shared each evening in devotional communion became their executioner. The marriage bed became an altar of revenge, and the woman they had purchased to preserve their bloodline became the architect of their complete annihilation. Before we descend into the suffocating atmosphere of Cypress Weep, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight. If this is your first time here, subscribe, because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine, into territories where human evil creates its own perfect punishment. This was not just crime, this was a breeding program that consumed its own makers, leaving behind only silence and the terrible knowledge that some forms of justice are too patient to be recognized until it is far too late to escape them. Cypress Wheat Plantation squatted like a cancer in the heart of sunken Trace County, Mississippi, accessible only by a single rotting causeway that disappeared beneath black water when the rains came heavy, cutting off the mansion from the civilized world with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The isolation was not accidental but carefully engineered, designed by 3 generations of Devereux patriarchs who understood that what they practiced within those walls required the kind of privacy that only complete separation from human judgment could provide. The mansion itself was a monument to antebellum delusion, its Greek revival columns choked with strangling vines, its wide verandas sagging under the weight of decades of humidity and moral decay. From the Big Black River, pilots reported that the house seemed to float on a lake of perpetual mist, its windows glowing with an unnatural light that made even the boldest rivermen quicken their pace and avoid making eye contact with whatever moved behind those curtained windows. Captain Elias Thorne of the Union Army Medical Corps would later describe the estate in his diary as existing in a state of geographic quarantine, cut off from civilization by design rather than circumstance. The family had deliberately chosen this suffocating isolation, he wrote, as if they understood that what they practiced within those walls required the kind of privacy that only complete separation from human judgment could provide. The swamp itself seemed complicit in their secrecy, its waters reflecting nothing, its silence so complete that visitors reported hearing their own heartbeats echo off the cypress trunks, like drums in a funeral march. The name itself carried an ominous poetry that revealed more than its creators had intended. Cypress trees, those ancient sentinels of southern waterways, were known to weep a reddish resin when wounded, staining the bark like dried blood that never quite dried. Local folklore claimed that the trees surrounding the plantation wept constantly, as if mourning some terrible knowledge they could never speak, some crime so fundamental that even the vegetation had been corrupted by proximity to it. The mansion's architectural grandeur could not disguise the fundamental wrongness that seemed to seep from its very foundations, a wrongness that made horses refuse to cross the causeway and dogs howl in distress at the property's borders. What seemed like eccentric isolation was, in truth, the perfect laboratory for experiments that required absolute control over every variable, every witness, every possible escape route. The Devereux family had not simply chosen to live apart from the world. They had constructed a private kingdom where the normal laws of human decency could be suspended in service of something they considered far more important than individual suffering. This wasn't just a home, it was a carefully designed trap, and everyone who entered its boundaries became either a participant or a victim in an ongoing horror that had been refined through generations of practice, perfected like a recipe passed down from grandmother to granddaughter, each generation adding new refinements to the systematic brutality that was their family's true inheritance. Seraphine Devereux ruled Cypress Weep with the iron authority of someone who believed that bloodlines carried more weight than human lives. That genetic purity justified any sacrifice, any violation, any systematic brutality required to preserve what she saw as her family's divine heritage. At 63, she moved through the mansion's dimly lit corridors with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to absolute power, her pale eyes constantly calculating, always measuring the human resources under her control against the requirements of her grand design. The Devereux bloodline bore the unmistakable marks of generations of inbreeding, a practice the family had elevated to the level of religious doctrine, convinced that mixing their superior genetic material with outside blood would dilute the very qualities that made them worthy of power. Julian, the heir, was a trembling, sickly creature of 28, who possessed the mental capacity of a confused child and the physical constitution of a man already dying by inches. His hands shook constantly, his speech slurred with the thick tongue of someone whose brain had never quite formed properly, and his pale, watery eyes held the vacant confusion of someone who understood that he was broken but could never comprehend why. His sister Corinthia was, if anything, a more tragic testament to the family's obsession with genetic purity. At 25, she spent her days propped in a chair by the library window, her limbs twisted by some congenital malformation that left her unable to walk or even feed herself without assistance. Her mind sharp enough to understand her own imprisonment, but too damaged to articulate the horror of her existence. She watched the world through those windows with the desperate intensity of someone who knew she would never be permitted to join it, her fingers constantly picking at the embroidered covering on her lap, as if trying to unravel some invisible prison that held her captive. The family's medical history, meticulously documented in ledgers that would later horrify investigators, read like a catalog of genetic catastrophe. Stillbirths, infant mortality, seizure disorders, and what the family euphemistically called nervous conditions, ran through their ancestry like a poison river, each generation producing fewer viable offspring, each child more damaged than the last. Yet, rather than recognizing these patterns as a warning, Seraphine had convinced herself that they represented temporary setbacks in a grand genetic experiment that would ultimately produce a superior human being. The Cypress Weep ledger of holdings and increase contained entries that reduced human beings to breeding statistics, with Hattie listed simply as prime breeding stock, H17, acquired 1862, exceptional health and constitution, reproductive potential estimated at 6 to 8 viable offspring over 10-year breeding cycle. The clinical language could not disguise the fundamental horror of what was being documented, the systematic reduction of human beings to their biological functions, the careful calculation of suffering required to preserve a bloodline that was already beyond salvation. What no one realized was that this systematic dehumanization had created something far more dangerous than the Devereaux family could possibly comprehend. In treating human beings as experimental animals, they had given those same human beings every moral justification for treating their captors with the same cold, clinical detachment. The machine they had built to preserve their bloodline had inadvertently manufactured its own destruction in the form of a young woman who possessed both the intelligence to understand their system and the patience to turn it against them with surgical precision. Old Saul had survived 7 decades in bondage by understanding that knowledge was the only currency that could not be stolen, the only weapon that could not be confiscated, the only form of resistance that could hide in plain sight, until the moment came to strike with deadly precision. His hands, gnarled by arthritis and decades of field work, remained steady enough to prepare the remedies that kept the enslaved community alive when the plantation's medical care consisted of nothing more than prayers and patent medicines, and his mind, sharpened by necessity and nourished by secrets passed down through generations, held the accumulated wisdom of African healing traditions that had been forbidden but never forgotten. The old man had recognized something dangerous in Hattie from her first day at Cypress Weep, a combination of intelligence and fury that reminded him of his own grandmother, a woman who had poisoned 3 overseers before dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, her secret knowledge intact and her revenge complete. When Seraphine began discussing her breeding program within earshot of the quarters, her voice carrying across the still air like the whisper of approaching death, Saul understood that Hattie would need more than prayers and folk remedies to survive what was being planned for her. He began her education in the healing arts with herbs and roots, teaching her which plants could soothe pain and which could bring eternal sleep. But as the months passed and the threat became more specific, he moved on to more dangerous knowledge. The lessons took place in the root cellar beneath the old kitchen, where jars of preserved plants lined the walls like a pharmacopoeia of secrets, each container holding the accumulated wisdom of generations of enslaved healers who had learned to fight back with weapons their oppressors could never recognize. The final lesson came on a suffocating night in July, when the air was so thick with humidity that even the mosquitoes seemed sluggish and the cypress trees hung motionless as funeral shrouds. From behind a loose stone, Saul withdrew a small vial filled with what appeared to be liquid silver, mercury that moved like living metal, capturing and reflecting the candlelight in mesmerizing patterns that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. "They call it quicksilver," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge accumulated over decades of careful observation, "because it moves like something alive, but it brings nothing but death to those who consume it. A drop in water, you can't taste it. A drop in wine, you can't smell it. But it builds up in the body like sin, eating away at the nerves and the brain until the person shakes like they got the Holy Ghost, except there ain't nothing holy about what's happening to them." He wrapped her fingers around the vial, his ancient eyes holding hers, with an intensity that made her understand this was not just information, but a sacred trust being passed from one generation to the next, a weapon forged in the fires of systematic oppression and refined through generations of careful practice. The mercury had come from the plantation's own supplies, ordered by Seraphine for what she claimed was mirror resilvering, though the quantity far exceeded any legitimate purpose, and no mirrors in the mansion showed any signs of recent maintenance. Saul had been slowly siphoning small amounts for months, understanding instinctively that the Devereaux family's obsession with purity would eventually require a more permanent solution than simple escape. What he was giving Hattie was not just a weapon, but a form of justice as cold and inexorable as the metal itself, a way to turn the family's own tools of control into instruments of their destruction, using their own daily rituals against them with the precision of a master craftsman. The wedding ceremony that bound Hattie to Julian Devereaux in the eyes of both God and Mississippi law was performed on a suffocating August evening when even the cypress trees seemed to bow their heads in shame, their Spanish moss hanging like funeral veils over a ritual that perverted every sacred tradition it claimed to honor. Reverend Josiah Proudfoot, a traveling preacher whose moral flexibility had been purchased with a gold coin and the promise of more, stood before the makeshift altar in the plantation's abandoned chapel, his hands trembling as he opened his prayer book to pages he had never intended to read under such circumstances. The chapel itself had not hosted a legitimate ceremony in over a decade, its pews empty except for dust and the occasional field mouse, its windows so thick with grime that the afternoon light filtered through like something viewed from the bottom of a grave. Seraphine had chosen this setting with deliberate calculation, understanding that the isolation and decay would prevent any unwanted witnesses, while the religious trappings would provide legal legitimacy for what was essentially a commercial transaction in human flesh. Hattie stood in a dress that had belonged to Julian's deceased aunt, the yellowed silk hanging loose on her frame, like a shroud tailored for someone else's corpse, the lace collar scratching against her neck like a noose being slowly tightened. She had been scrubbed and powdered and perfumed until she barely recognized herself, transformed into a grotesque parody of bridal innocence that made her stomach churn with revulsion every time she caught her reflection in the chapel's tarnished mirrors. Julian, propped up between two chairs to prevent him from falling, stared at her with the vacant confusion of a child who has been promised a treat but cannot understand why everyone around him looks so serious. His wedding suit, inherited from his father, hung on his wasted frame like expensive drapery on a scarecrow, and drool occasionally escaped from the corner of his mouth, requiring his mother to dab it away with a handkerchief as if he were an overgrown infant rather than a grown man participating in his own wedding ceremony. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of perverted ritual, each traditional element twisted into something obscene and blasphemous. When Proudfoot asked if anyone objected to the union, Seraphine's cold smile made it clear that such objections would be neither welcomed nor survived, and the silence that followed was thick with the understanding that this was not a celebration but an execution disguised as a sacrament. When the time came for the exchange of vows, Julian's slurred responses had to be repeated by his mother, who spoke for him as if he were a ventriloquist's dummy rather than a human being capable of consent. The words of love and devotion became a cruel mockery when filtered through Seraphine's voice, transformed into a business contract that reduced both bride and groom to their biological functions in her grand genetic experiment. But it was the moment of the kiss that would haunt witnesses for the rest of their lives, the instant when two forms of violence converged in an embrace that sealed both their fates. Hattie, her face a mask of resignation that concealed calculations as precise as those of any military strategist, pressed her lips to Julian's with the gentle tenderness of someone administering last rites. The kiss lasted only seconds, but in those seconds she sealed both their fates with an intimacy that was simultaneously an act of submission and a declaration of war. The ceremony concluded with the sharing of sacramental wine from a silver cup that had been in the Devereaux family for 4 generations, its surface engraved with symbols that predated Christianity and spoke to older, darker traditions of power and bloodshed. As Hattie raised the cup to her lips and then passed it to Julian, she understood that she had just participated in the creation of a perfect weapon, a daily ritual that would allow her to administer justice in doses so small that her victims would never suspect they were being systematically destroyed. The Holy Rite had become the perfect cover for methodical murder, and every subsequent evening would bring her one step closer to the freedom that could only be purchased with their deaths. The domestic routine that followed the wedding ceremony was choreographed with the precision of a military operation, every detail designed to reinforce Hattie's status as both wife and prisoner, both breeding stock and closely monitored asset, whose every movement was calculated against the family's expectations of reproductive success. Her days were spent in isolation in the mansion's east wing, where a series of rooms had been converted into what Seraphine euphemistically called the nursery quarters, though their true purpose was to provide complete control over every aspect of Hattie's existence until she fulfilled her biological destiny. The rooms themselves were decorated with a grotesque parody of domestic comfort, furnished with imported fabrics and expensive furniture that could not disguise their essential function as a luxurious prison. The windows were fitted with bars disguised as decorative ironwork, the doors locked from the outside during certain hours, and every piece of furniture was bolted to the floor to prevent its use as a weapon. Seraphine had learned from experience that even the most seemingly docile subjects could become dangerous when desperation reached its breaking point. Each evening at precisely 8 o'clock, the family gathered in the library for what they called their devotional hour, a tradition that combined religious reading with the consumption of wine from the ornate silver decanter that occupied the place of honor on Seraphine's mahogany desk. The ritual had been established by Julian's grandfather as a way of maintaining family unity and spiritual discipline. But under Seraphine's leadership, it had evolved into something closer to a secular communion, a daily reaffirmation of blood loyalty that excluded outsiders by design and reinforced the family's conviction of their own superiority. The library itself was a monument to the family's intellectual pretensions, its walls lined with books that no one had read in decades, their leather bindings cracking with age and neglect. Portraits of deceased Devereux patriarchs stared down from gilded frames, their pale eyes seeming to follow visitors with the same predatory calculation that characterized their living descendants. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and leather polish, but underneath these civilized scents lurked something else, something that made sensitive visitors feel nauseated without understanding why. Hattie's inclusion in this ceremony represented a fundamental violation of the ritual's original purpose, but Seraphine had convinced herself that genetic necessity justified any temporary corruption of family tradition. Julian would slump in his chair, occasionally making soft noises of pleasure as the wine dulled whatever pain lived behind his confused eyes, while Corinthia watched the proceedings with the sharp intelligence of someone whose damaged body had never dimmed her understanding of power dynamics and family hierarchies. The wine itself came from the family's private vineyard, a sour red that had been sweetened with honey and spiced with herbs to mask its fundamental unpleasantness and the bitter aftertaste that came from grapes grown in soil that had been fertilized. With too many secrets, Seraphine would pour from the crystal decanter with ceremonial gravity, filling 3 glasses that were passed clockwise around the room, each participant taking exactly 2 sips before passing the glass to the next person, the ritual's precision serving to reinforce the family's sense of order and control. The entire ritual rarely lasted more than 15 minutes, but those 15 minutes represented the only period each day when Hattie was permitted in the family's presence as something approaching an equal, and she understood that this represented both her greatest vulnerability and her greatest opportunity. What none of them realized was that Hattie had begun to view these evening gatherings as her daily opportunity to practice a form of communion far older and more elemental than anything in Christian tradition. Each morning she would slip into the library during the hour when the family took their afternoon rest and add exactly 3 drops of mercury to the wine decanter, stirring the liquid with a silver spoon until the poison was completely dissolved and undetectable. The mercury settled into the wine like liquid starlight, invisible but inexorable, building up in their systems with the patience of geological time, each evening's ritual carrying them a little closer to the neurological catastrophe that would eventually consume them. Before we continue deeper into this methodical campaign of revenge, I need to ask, do you think what Hattie was doing was murder or justice? Tell me in the comments, because the answer to that question will determine how you understand everything that follows. If this is your first time here, subscribe so you don't miss the clinical precision with which this breeding program destroyed itself from within. Captain Elias Thorne arrived at Cypress Weep in the early spring of 1865 with the methodical efficiency of a man trained to diagnose disease and document suffering with scientific precision, his medical bag heavy with instruments designed to measure and categorize the varieties of human misery he had encountered during 3 years of war. As the Union Army's advance pushed deeper into Mississippi, his medical unit had been tasked with examining abandoned plantations for signs of epidemic illness that might threaten the occupying forces, and the reports filtering back from Cypress Weep suggested a medical mystery that required immediate investigation. The scene that greeted Thorne when he crossed the rotting causeway defied every medical explanation in his considerable experience, presenting him with symptoms that seemed to have been carefully orchestrated to confuse diagnosis while providing clear evidence of systematic poisoning to anyone with the knowledge to recognize the patterns. Julian Devereaux, now reduced to a trembling wreck, who could barely form coherent sentences, exhibited symptoms that suggested simultaneous neurological decay and heavy metal poisoning, though Thorne could identify no environmental source for such contamination. The young man's hands shook with palsy-like tremors that intensified whenever he attempted any fine motor control. His gums had receded to expose blackened teeth that were loose in their sockets, and his speech had deteriorated to a barely comprehensible mumble punctuated by fits of inexplicable weeping that seemed to arise from some deep neurological damage rather than emotional distress. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor that suggested kidney failure, and his pupils remained dilated even in bright light, indicating damage to the nervous system that controlled basic autonomic functions. Corinthia presented an even more puzzling clinical picture, her existing physical disabilities now complicated by what appeared to be acute mercury poisoning, though she had never worked in hat-making or any other trade that would expose her to such toxins. Her hair had begun falling out in patches, leaving bald spots that revealed scalp lesions characteristic of heavy metal exposure. Her skin had developed a metallic odor that no amount of bathing could eliminate, and her once sharp mind now drifted in and out of coherent thought like someone struggling to surface from deep water. But it was Seraphine who represented the most disturbing case study in Thorne's growing collection of medical mysteries, a woman whose iron will and commanding presence had been completely destroyed by neurological damage that seemed to target the very qualities that had once made her formidable. The family matriarch, once renowned for her ability to intimidate grown men with a single glance, had deteriorated into a paranoid, raving creature who spent her days pacing the mansion's corridors, muttering about curses and divine retribution, while her body slowly consumed itself from within. Her teeth had loosened in their sockets, to the point where eating solid food had become impossible. Her kidneys were failing at a rate that suggested acute poisoning rather than age-related decline, and her nervous system had begun the irreversible shutdown that Thorne recognized as the final stage of chronic mercury exposure. Most disturbing of all was the way her paranoia had focused on the one person in the household who showed no signs of illness, creating accusations that revealed more about the family's guilty conscience than any conscious understanding of what was actually happening to them. Throughout his examination of the family, Thorne was struck by the stark contrast presented by Hattie, whose robust health and clear-eyed intelligence seemed to mock the medical catastrophe unfolding around her, like a living reminder of what human beings were supposed to look like when they were not slowly dying from systematic poisoning. He questioned her extensively about possible sources of contamination, dietary changes, or environmental factors that might explain the family's synchronized decline. But her responses were those of a simple, frightened woman whose only concern was caring for her afflicted husband and his relatives. Thorne's journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling to reconcile his medical training with evidence that seemed to point toward supernatural intervention, unable to accept the possibility that someone he considered intellectually inferior might be capable of orchestrating such a sophisticated campaign of murder. The symptoms were too specific, too coordinated, and too perfectly targeted to be explained by natural disease or environmental contamination. Yet his scientific worldview could not accommodate the possibility that an enslaved woman might possess both the knowledge and the determination required to systematically poison her oppressors with a sophistication that rivaled anything in his medical textbooks. The systematic search of Cypress Weep began at dawn on a morning when the mist rose from the black water like the ghosts of all the secrets the plantation had buried, and Captain Thorne approached the investigation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood that the truth was often hidden in the mundane details that others overlooked, in the intersection of seemingly unrelated facts that revealed patterns invisible to casual observation. His soldiers moved through the mansion room by room, documenting everything from the contents of medicine cabinets to the residue in cooking pots, searching for any clue that might explain the medical catastrophe they were witnessing. The mansion itself seemed designed to frustrate investigation, its numerous rooms connected by corridors that led nowhere, its hidden passages and concealed doorways, creating a maze of secrets within secrets that had been refined over generations of Devereaux occupation. Dust covers draped furniture that had not been used in decades, creating ghostly shapes that seemed to move in the soldiers' peripheral vision, while portraits of dead ancestors watched from gilded frames with eyes that seemed to follow intruders through rooms thick with the accumulated weight of family secrets. The kitchen yielded evidence of systematic food preparation on a scale that seemed excessive for the small family, with cooking implements that showed signs of recent use despite the household's obvious decline, and stores of exotic spices and preserved ingredients that suggested culinary traditions more sophisticated than the simple plantation fare that most enslaved cooks were permitted to prepare. Hidden behind sacks of ordinary flour and cornmeal, the soldiers discovered jars of preserved plants and roots that defied easy identification, some labeled in a script that appeared to be African in origin, others marked with symbols that belonged to no written language any of them recognized. The library yielded the most significant discovery in the form of the Cypress Weep Ledger of Holdings and Increase, a bound volume that documented every aspect of plantation operations with the cold precision of a business document, its pages revealing the systematic reduction of human beings to their economic value with a clarity that was both horrifying and legally damning. Thorne initially dismissed the ledger as routine agricultural records, but as he read more carefully, the true horror of what he was seeing began to penetrate his understanding like poison seeping into clean water. Human beings were listed alongside livestock, their reproductive potential calculated with the same clinical detachment used to evaluate breeding cattle, their ages and physical characteristics documented with the thoroughness of someone who understood that genetic planning required precise record-keeping. Hattie's entry in the ledger was particularly detailed, describing her physical attributes, health history, and genetic potential in language that reduced her to nothing more than a biological resource to be exploited for the family's benefit. Her humanity completely erased in favor of coldly calculated reproductive statistics. Cross-referencing the ledger with invoices he discovered in Seraphine's private desk, Thorne uncovered a purchase order from J.H. Glass Apothecary in Vicksburg for 4 ounces of quicksilver, supposedly for mirror resilvering, though the quantity was enormous for such a purpose. Enough mercury to kill a dozen people if administered correctly over an extended period. Yet there was no evidence that any mirrors in the mansion had been recently resilvered, and several showed clear signs of age-related deterioration that such maintenance would have addressed, creating a discrepancy that should have been impossible to ignore. The pieces of evidence were arranged before him like components of a puzzle, but the picture they formed was one that Thorne's worldview could not accommodate, requiring him to accept the possibility that someone he considered inherently inferior might possess both the intelligence and the determination required to orchestrate such a sophisticated campaign of systematic murder. The systematic nature of the poisoning suggested someone with detailed knowledge of toxicology and consistent access to the victim's food and drink. Yet the only person who met those criteria was Hattie, and the idea that an enslaved woman could mastermind such a complex revenge scheme seemed impossible to a man whose racial prejudices functioned as a form of cognitive blindness. Instead, Thorne convinced himself that the mercury poisoning must be the result of environmental contamination, perhaps from mining operations upstream or industrial waste that had seeped into the plantation's water supply through underground channels that could not be easily detected. His final report would attribute the family's deaths to a combination of congenital weakness and environmental factors, completely missing the human agency that had transformed their own daily rituals into instruments of precise methodical execution, ensuring that the real story would remain hidden for decades to come. The end came for Julian Devereaux on a night when the mercury had finally accumulated to lethal levels in his ravaged nervous system, and the tremors that had plagued him for months erupted into violent convulsions that shook the mansion's walls and sent the remaining servants fleeing into the swamp, their screams echoing across the black water like the cries of damned souls finally released from some terrible bondage. His body arched and twisted with inhuman force, foam bubbling from his lips as his brain fired random electrical impulses through neural pathways that had been systematically destroyed by months of slow poisoning. The convulsions began just after midnight, starting as an intensification of the tremors that had become his constant companion, but quickly escalating into something that seemed to possess him like a malevolent spirit. His back arched until his spine seemed ready to snap. His limbs flailed with such violence that furniture was overturned and precious family heirlooms shattered against the walls, and the sounds that emerged from his throat were less human speech than the anguished cries of something trapped between life and death. Hattie sat by his bedside through the final hours, maintaining the performance of the devoted wife, even as she watched the culmination of her patient campaign of justice unfold with the inexorable precision of a perfectly calibrated timepiece. She held his hand as the convulsions gradually weakened, feeling his pulse flutter and fade like a dying bird, and when the end finally came, she was the only witness to his last breath, the only person who understood that his death was not a tragic consequence of genetic weakness, but the inevitable result of a plan as methodical as clockwork and as patient as geological time. Seraphine's reaction to her son's death was a masterpiece of mercury-induced paranoia, her damaged mind seizing on the one explanation that allowed her to maintain some sense of control over the inexplicable catastrophe that had consumed her family like a slow-burning fire. Standing in the library where she had once held court, her hair falling out in clumps, her hands shaking uncontrollably, she pointed a trembling finger at Hattie and shrieked accusations of witchcraft that echoed through the mansion's empty corridors like the ravings of someone who had finally descended into complete madness. The accusation was both completely wrong and absolutely correct, though not in the way Seraphine intended, revealing the kind of twisted logic that mercury poisoning inflicted on its victims in the final stages of neurological collapse. Hattie had indeed used supernatural knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved healers, but her weapon was not magic spells or voodoo curses. It was a precise understanding of toxicology combined with the patience to execute a plan that required months of careful calibration and perfect timing. She had turned the family's own devotional rituals into a delivery system for justice, using their trust in routine and tradition to blind them to the poison they consumed each evening with religious regularity. The kiss that had sealed their union had been the first act in a drama that would play out over months, each evening's wine ritual bringing them closer to the neurological catastrophe that would finally free her from the breeding program that had reduced her to nothing more than a biological resource. Seraphine's deteriorating mental state made her accusations increasingly frantic and incoherent, but her authority within the plantation's hierarchy remained absolute, and she ordered Jedediah Creek, the brutal overseer who had enforced her will for 2 decades, to eliminate what she was convinced was the supernatural threat that had destroyed her bloodline. Creek, his own mind clouded by mercury exposure from the servants' meals he occasionally shared, approached his task with the same methodical brutality he had always employed against those who challenged the plantation's authority. The confrontation came at midnight in the swamp itself, where Creek had tracked Hattie's escape route through mud and standing water. But the same knowledge that had allowed her to poison her captors had also taught her the secret paths through the wetlands, the solid ground hidden beneath deceptive water, the safe routes that only someone who had studied the swamp's moods and dangers could navigate in darkness. Creek, confident in his strength and blinded by rage, pursued her into deep water and soft mud, and the swamp claimed him with the same inexorable patience that had characterized Hattie's campaign of revenge, leaving no trace except bubbles rising through black water that reflected nothing but darkness. Captain Thorne's final medical report on the Cypress Weep incident represents one of the most comprehensive examples of willful blindness in the annals of military medicine. A document that meticulously cataloged every symptom of mercury poisoning while steadfastly refusing to acknowledge the obvious source of the contamination, creating a masterpiece of intellectual contortion that would influence official understanding of the case for generations to come. His clinical observations were impeccable in their detail and accuracy. He correctly identified the neurological damage, the kidney failure, the dental problems, and the psychological deterioration that characterized chronic heavy metal exposure, yet his conclusions attributed these symptoms to a combination of genetic weakness and environmental factors beyond human control. The report's discussion of potential causation reveals the extraordinary mental gymnastics required to avoid recognizing Hattie's agency in the family's destruction, a systematic process of elimination that considered every possibility except the one that was most obviously supported by the available evidence. Thorne considered and dismissed various theories, including contaminated well water, industrial runoff from upstream mining operations, and even the possibility of deliberate poisoning by Union saboteurs seeking to eliminate prominent Confederate sympathizers. But he never seriously entertained the idea that an enslaved woman might possess the knowledge and determination required to execute such a sophisticated campaign of murder. His interview notes with Hattie preserved in the military archives with the clinical detachment of someone documenting a medical curiosity rather than a potential criminal investigation, show a woman carefully maintaining the performance of simple-minded grief, while providing answers that reinforced every stereotype about enslaved people that made her invisible as a potential perpetrator. She spoke in the dialect expected of her station, expressed confusion about medical terminology, and consistently directed attention toward supernatural explanations that resonated with contemporary racial prejudices about primitive African beliefs and the inherent superstition of enslaved populations. The systematic nature of this blindness reveals more than simple investigative incompetence. It demonstrates the way that racial prejudice can function as a form of cognitive disability, preventing otherwise intelligent people from perceiving evidence that contradicts their fundamental assumptions about social hierarchy and human capability. Thorne's failure to solve the mystery of Cypress Weep was not due to lack of evidence or analytical skill, but to his inability to imagine that the woman he dismissed as a simple-minded victim might actually be the architect of one of the most sophisticated revenge schemes in American history. The Cypress Weep ledger, despite its obvious documentation of systematic human trafficking and forced breeding, was filed in Thorne's reports under agricultural records and treated as evidence of the plantation's economic operations rather than its criminal activities, demonstrating how bureaucratic categories could be used to obscure rather than illuminate the truth. The entries describing Hattie as breeding stock were noted but not interpreted as evidence of sexual slavery, and the correlation between her arrival and the family's medical decline was observed but not investigated, creating a pattern of willful ignorance that would protect her secret for over a century. Most significantly, Thorne's inventory of the mansion's contents included the mercury-tainted wine decanter, which tested positive for quicksilver contamination at levels that should have been immediately suspicious. Yet his report explained this as evidence of the environmental poisoning theory, rather than proof of deliberate adulteration. The possibility that someone might be systematically adding mercury to the family's nightly wine was considered so unlikely that it was dismissed without investigation, despite the fact that this explanation would have accounted for every aspect of the medical evidence he had so carefully documented. The official record that emerged from Thorne's investigation would shape public understanding of the Cypress Weep incident for generations, creating a sanitized narrative of genetic tragedy and environmental catastrophe that completely erased the human agency behind the family's destruction. This institutional cover-up was not the result of conspiracy, but of systematic inability to recognize intelligence and determination in people who were considered inherently inferior, and it ensured that Hattie's perfect crime would remain undetected for decades to come, protected by the same prejudices that had made her suffering seem acceptable in the first place. In the chaos that followed Jedediah Creek's disappearance and Seraphine's final descent into mercury-induced madness, Hattie simply walked away from Cypress Weep as if she had never existed, dissolving into the ranks of displaced people that the war's end had scattered across the Mississippi Delta like seeds on fertile ground. Her transition from enslaved property to free citizen masked by the documentary chaos that made individual disappearances easy to overlook. The collapse of the Confederacy had created a world where records were lost, identities could be reinvented, and someone with sufficient intelligence and determination could literally disappear from one life and emerge in another without leaving a trace that investigators could follow. The Freedmen's Bureau, established to help former enslaved people navigate their new legal status, recorded an interview in 1870 with an unnamed woman who claimed to have worked at Cypress Weep during its final years, providing testimony that revealed intimate knowledge of the plantation's operations while carefully avoiding any details that might compromise her own security. The transcript, labeled interview number 447, contains carefully coded descriptions of the breeding program that only someone with direct experience could have provided. Yet the interviewee's identity was never recorded, and her current location remained unknown. The woman's testimony described the Devereaux family's death in terms that mixed folk wisdom with precise medical observation, demonstrating an understanding of mercury poisoning that was far more sophisticated than her simple dialect suggested. They got sick from the inside out, shaking like they had the devil in their bones, their teeth falling out like old corn kernels, their minds going soft as swamp mud. The old mistress, she kept saying it was a curse, but we knew it was just the bad meat finally coming back to eat the ones who served it. When pressed for details about possible causes, the interviewee became evasive, speaking in metaphors that could be interpreted as either supernatural beliefs or coded descriptions of systematic poisoning. Sometimes the Lord works through instruments that look like ordinary things, like wine that tastes sweet but carries judgment, like kisses that feel like love but deliver justice. The family thought they owned everything on that plantation, but they never owned the knowledge that old Saul passed down, and they never understood that their own rituals could be turned against them. The interview concluded with a statement that would haunt researchers for generations, revealing the moral complexity that surrounded acts of resistance within systems of systematic oppression. People always want to know if what happened at Cypress Weep was murder or justice, but they're asking the wrong question. The real question is whether a breeding program that treated human beings like livestock ever gave those same human beings the moral right to treat their captors like the animals they claimed to be. Hattie's subsequent fate remains one of the great mysteries of Reconstruction history, though fragments of evidence suggest she may have surfaced in various locations throughout the South, always using different names, always maintaining the careful anonymity that had protected her at Cypress Weep. Some records suggest a woman matching her description worked as a midwife in New Orleans, using knowledge of plants and healing that would have been consistent with her training under Old Saul, while other documents point to a teacher in a freedmen's school in Arkansas whose understanding of chemistry and medicine impressed even educated white observers. What seems certain is that she understood the importance of maintaining her anonymity, not just to avoid prosecution for the Devereaux deaths, but to protect the broader knowledge that had made her campaign of revenge possible. The techniques she had learned represented generations of accumulated wisdom about resistance and survival, information that could be used by other people in similar circumstances, and her disappearance ensured that this knowledge would remain available to those who needed it, while staying hidden from those who would seek to suppress it through violence or legal persecution. The ruins of Cypress Weep became a fixture in Mississippi Delta folklore, one of those places where local legend and historical fact intertwined so completely that separating truth from embellishment became impossible even for professional historians armed with the most sophisticated research techniques. The plantation's isolation, which had once protected the Devereaux family's crimes from outside scrutiny, now protected their victims' secrets from historical investigation, and the swamp gradually reclaimed the mansion with the same inexorable patience that had characterized Hattie's campaign of revenge. By 1880, only the foundation stones remained visible above the waterline, their Greek Revival grandeur reduced to moss-covered ruins that seemed to emerge from the black water like the remnants of some lost civilization, while Spanish moss hung from the surrounding cypress trees like funeral shrouds, giving the site an atmosphere of perpetual mourning that discouraged casual visitors and encouraged supernatural explanations for the family's mysterious extinction. Local fishermen reported strange lights moving through the ruins on moonless nights, and some claimed to hear the sound of wedding music drifting across the water, though these accounts may have been influenced by the growing body of ghost stories that surrounded the plantation's history. The official version of events, based on Captain Thorne's medical report, described the Devereaux deaths as a tragic consequence of genetic weakness exacerbated by environmental factors, a narrative that allowed the broader community to avoid confronting the more disturbing implications of what had actually occurred at Cypress Weep. This sanitized account appeared in county histories and genealogical records, creating a documentary trail that emphasized the family's noble heritage while glossing over the systematic human trafficking that had been their primary source of wealth, and the breeding program that had been their final, desperate attempt to preserve their genetic legacy. But among the African American communities of the Delta, a different story was preserved and passed down through generations of careful oral tradition, transmitted through songs and stories that appeared to be simple folk tales but contained coded information about resistance techniques and survival strategies. These accounts, never committed to writing during the dangerous decades of Jim Crow, described Hattie not as a victim of circumstance, but as a folk hero who had used intelligence and patience to turn the tools of oppression against their wielders, transforming herself from breeding stock into the architect of her oppressor's destruction. The story of her systematic poisoning campaign became a template for understanding how resistance could take forms that were invisible to those in power, demonstrating that the most effective revenge was often the kind that remained unrecognized until it was too late to prevent or reverse. Her name became synonymous with the kind of quiet justice that survived by remaining undetected, and her techniques were studied and refined by subsequent generations of people who found themselves trapped in similar circumstances, ensuring that the knowledge she had inherited from Old Saul would continue to be available to those who needed it. Modern genealogists and local historians attempting to research the Devereaux family line encounter a frustrating wall of missing records and contradictory accounts that reflects the systematic nature of the cover-up that protected Hattie's secret for so long. Death certificates list environmental causes for the family's demise. Marriage records omit crucial details about the circumstances of Hattie's wedding, and property transfers show the plantation changing hands multiple times before being abandoned to the swamp, as if the land itself had been contaminated by its association with the breeding program and the systematic cruelty that had characterized its operations. The discovery of the Cypress Weep ledger in the Mississippi State Archives in 1998 finally provided documentary evidence of the systematic human trafficking that had been the foundation of the plantation's operations. But even this revelation failed to generate significant public interest, perhaps because the crimes it documented were too remote in time to inspire contemporary outrage, or perhaps because American society was still not ready to confront the full implications of what slavery had actually involved at its most systematic and brutal. The rediscovery of the Cypress Weep story in the 21st century began with a genealogy researcher named Dr. Patricia Williams, whose investigation into her own family history led her to question the official accounts of the plantation's demise and ultimately uncover evidence that previous historians had either missed or deliberately ignored, revealing how academic prejudices could perpetuate cover-ups long after the original perpetrators were dead. Working with newly digitized archives and oral history collections, Dr. Williams was able to piece together a more complete picture of what had actually occurred during those final months of the plantation's operation, using computational analysis to identify patterns that earlier researchers had been unable or unwilling to recognize. Her breakthrough came when she realized that the symptoms described in Captain Thorne's medical report were perfectly consistent with chronic mercury poisoning, and that the timing of the family's decline correlated precisely with the period when Hattie would have had access to their daily wine ritual. creating a causal relationship that was impossible to ignore once the proper analytical framework was applied. Cross-referencing this information with the Cypress Weep ledger and the apothecary records, Dr. Williams was able to reconstruct Hattie's method with scientific precision, demonstrating how someone with knowledge of traditional healing could have executed such a sophisticated campaign of systematic poisoning using materials that were readily available on the plantation itself. The implications of Dr. Williams's research extended far beyond the specific case of Cypress Weep, providing a template for understanding how resistance to slavery could take forms that were completely invisible to contemporary observers and to subsequent historians who shared similar prejudices about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people. Her work suggested that many mysterious deaths and illnesses on antebellum plantations might have been the result of similar campaigns of covert resistance, carried out by people whose knowledge of plants and minerals had been systematically underestimated by those who sought to control them through violence and legal oppression. Modern visitors to the site of Cypress Weep find only a few foundation stones protruding from the dark water and a single ancient cypress tree that local guides claim still weeps red resin in the spring months, though this phenomenon can be explained by perfectly natural causes related to seasonal sap flow and the tree's response to changing water levels. The isolation that once made the plantation perfect for its criminal activities now makes it attractive to ghost hunters and dark tourism enthusiasts, though most leave disappointed by the lack of dramatic supernatural manifestations, unaware that the real horror of the place lies not in ghostly apparitions, but in the systematic cruelty that was once practiced there with bureaucratic efficiency. The site's most profound impact comes not from ghostly encounters, but from its ability to make visitors confront uncomfortable truths about American history that remain relevant to contemporary discussions of power, resistance, and justice, forcing them to grapple with questions that have no easy answers about the relationship between systematic oppression and violent resistance. Standing among the ruins, surrounded by the silence of the swamp, visitors are forced to consider whether Hattie's campaign of systematic poisoning represented murder or justice, and whether the moral calculations that justified her actions might apply to contemporary situations where legal recourse is unavailable or ineffective. The story of Hattie and Cypress Weep has found new relevance in an era when Americans are being forced to confront the ongoing legacy of slavery and its systematic dehumanization of entire populations, providing a different model for understanding resistance than the more dramatic examples of rebellion and escape that dominate popular historical narratives. Her patient, methodical campaign of revenge offers a template for understanding how power could be challenged through intimate knowledge of chemistry and psychology rather than physical force, demonstrating that the most effective resistance was often the kind that remained invisible until it was too late to prevent or reverse. The mercury that destroyed the Devereaux family came from their own supplies, purchased with their own money and stored in their own house, administered through their own daily rituals by someone they had reduced to the status of breeding stock, creating a perfect example of how systematic oppression could create its own instruments of destruction through the very people it sought to control most completely. The breeding program that was designed to preserve their genetic heritage had inadvertently created the perfect conditions for someone with the right knowledge and sufficient patience to turn their own tools of control against them with devastating effectiveness. The final lesson of Cypress Weep lies not in the specific details of Hattie's campaign of revenge, but in what her story reveals about the way systematic oppression creates its own instruments of destruction through the very people it seeks to control and exploit, transforming victims into architects of justice through the patient application of knowledge that their oppressors never suspected they possessed. The Devereaux family's breeding program was designed to preserve their genetic heritage while extracting maximum economic value from human reproduction. But it inadvertently created the perfect conditions for someone with the right knowledge and sufficient patience to turn their own daily rituals against them with the precision of a master chemist. The mercury that killed them came from their own supplies, purchased with their own money and stored in their own house, a detail that reveals the fundamental blindness that characterized their approach to human ownership and control. They could calculate the reproductive potential of their human property with clinical precision, but they never understood that the same intelligence they sought to exploit for genetic purposes could also be turned against them in ways that were invisible to their prejudiced perceptions of human capability. The delivery system was their own devotional tradition, a daily gathering that reinforced family solidarity while providing consistent access to all the intended victims, demonstrating how rituals designed to create unity and shared identity could be perverted into instruments of systematic destruction by someone who understood their psychological and practical significance. The wine they shared each evening in celebration of their genetic superiority became their executioner, administered by the very person whose genetic material they sought to appropriate for their own purposes. The knowledge that made the poisoning possible came from healing traditions that had survived centuries of systematic suppression, proving that some forms of resistance are too fundamental to be completely eradicated by legal prohibitions or physical violence. Old Saul's understanding of plant and mineral toxicology represented the accumulated wisdom of generations of enslaved healers who had learned to fight back with weapons their oppressors could never recognize, creating a form of resistance that was as patient as it was deadly. Perhaps most significantly, the cover-up that protected Hattie's secret was not the result of any conspiracy, but of the same racial prejudices that had made the breeding program seem acceptable in the first place, demonstrating how systematic blindness could perpetuate injustice long after its original perpetrators were dead. The investigators who documented every symptom of mercury poisoning while failing to identify its source were blinded by their inability to imagine that someone they considered inherently inferior might be capable of such sophisticated planning and execution. This systematic blindness ensured that Hattie's perfect crime remained undetected for over a century, hidden in plain sight within official records that contained all the evidence necessary to solve the mystery but lacked the interpretive framework needed to recognize what they were seeing. The same prejudices that had justified her enslavement also ensured her escape from any consequences for her actions, creating a form of justice that was as invisible as it was complete, protected by the very assumptions that had made her suffering seem acceptable in the first place. The ruins of Cypress Weep continue to sink into the Mississippi Delta mud, carrying with them the physical evidence of crimes that were documented but never prosecuted, acknowledged but never fully understood. The cypress tree that gives the site its name still stands in the black water, its roots extending deep into soil that holds the remains of both victims and perpetrators, a living monument to the way that systematic oppression ultimately consumes even those who benefit from its immediate advantages. The most disturbing truth about the Cypress Weep story is not that it happened, but that it represents only one example of a much larger pattern of resistance and revenge that remains largely hidden from historical view, concealed by the same prejudices that made the original crimes possible. Across the American South, in the intimate spaces of kitchens and bedrooms and family dining rooms, similar campaigns of covert warfare were being waged by people whose intelligence and determination were systematically underestimated by those who sought to control them through violence and legal oppression. As the last foundation stones of Cypress Sweep disappear beneath the rising waters of climate change and time, the story of Hattie and her methodical campaign of mercury-laced justice forces us to confront a question that extends far beyond the boundaries of historical curiosity and into the realm of contemporary moral philosophy. In a world where systematic oppression makes legal recourse impossible, where human beings are reduced to their biological functions and treated as breeding stock, what forms of resistance become not only justified, but morally necessary? The mercury that destroyed the Devereaux family was administered with the same clinical precision that characterized their breeding program, each dose calculated to produce maximum suffering while maintaining plausible deniability, creating a perfect mirror of the systematic cruelty they had inflicted on generations of enslaved people. Hattie's campaign of revenge was not the product of sudden rage or desperate impulse, but the result of patient observation, careful planning, and the methodical application of knowledge that had been passed down through generations of people who understood that survival sometimes required the willingness to become what your oppressors had made necessary. The breeding program that killed Julian, Corinthia, and Seraphine was not the mercury they consumed each evening, but the system of systematic dehumanization that had created the conditions under which such poisoning became an act of justice rather than murder. They died not from heavy metal toxicity, but from the accumulated weight of their own moral choices, the inevitable consequence of treating human beings as experimental animals in service of genetic fantasies that were already beyond salvation. The real poison at Cypress Sweep was not the quicksilver that Hattie added to their wine, but the ideology that had convinced them that some human beings existed solely for the benefit of others, that genetic purity justified any violation, any systematic brutality required to preserve what they saw as their divine heritage. This poison had been building up in their moral systems for generations, eating away at their capacity for human empathy until they became monsters who could document their crimes in ledgers and purchase orders without experiencing any recognition of their own moral decay. The silence that followed their deaths was not the absence of sound, but the presence of justice finally achieved, through methods that were invisible to those who had never understood that intelligence and determination could be weapons more deadly than any physical force. Hattie walked away from Cypress Sweep carrying with her the knowledge that systematic oppression always creates its own instruments of destruction, that the same intelligence that oppressors seek to exploit can be turned against them with devastating effectiveness by people who understand that patience is often more powerful than rage. The cypress tree that still stands in the black water continues to weep its red resin, but the tears are not for the dead family whose crimes created their own punishment. They are for all the victims whose stories remain untold, whose acts of resistance remain unrecognized, whose intelligence and determination have been systematically erased from historical memory by people who cannot imagine that their victims might be the authors of their own liberation. The most chilling truth about the Cypress Sweep story is not that it happened once, but that it continues to happen in forms that remain invisible to those who benefit from systematic oppression, carried out by people whose knowledge and determination are still being systematically underestimated by those who seek to control them. The poison legacy of slavery is not just the historical trauma it inflicted, but the ongoing reality that such systems of oppression continue to create the conditions under which similar acts of resistance become not only possible, but morally necessary. Subscribe if you understand that the most important stories are often the ones that make us question everything we thought we knew about justice, resistance, and the true price of systematic oppression. Because somewhere in the intimate spaces where power meets its victims, The descendants of Hattie's knowledge are still adding drops of liquid justice to the wine of those who mistake. Their temporary advantage for permanent immunity, and the only question that matters is whether we will recognize these acts of resistance when they finally surface from the silence that protects them.